You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Sarah Kaufman at the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation. Sarah joined us in Miami at the RailVolution conference to talk about autonomous vehicle policy, acceptable safety levels, and what happens to New York City taxis. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next.
Well, Sarah Kaufman, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm here from New York City, the greatest city in the world. And I am a big transit fan and multimodalism fan. One of the reasons I think New York is the greatest city in the world is that we have about 27 modes of transportation. Things like subways, buses, ferries, bikes, taxis. We have everything.
Aerial tram,
yeah. We have a lot going on. And so I'm happy to be working on that topic at New York University at the Rudin Center for Transportation.
How did you get into transportation? Like, what was your first entree into the subject?
I've always really loved cities, especially in New York City. And I studied a bit of telecommunications in college, and I thought that it was really interesting how the computer networks, or how computers connect with each other and talk to each other, seem to really parallel transportation networks in cities. And so I thought that that was kind of a fascinating parallel that I saw when I was in college and then grad school at NYU. I also saw how little interaction there was at the time between transportation and technology, and felt like I could really fill a void there. And there was a lot of low-hanging fruit to address there.
So after that, how did you get into the profession in terms of transportation overall?
Well, I went to NYU for urban planning, and there I became more interested in transportation. And so I did a master's thesis on bus arrival time systems. At the time, we didn't have what is now called bus time, which says through an app or through a website when the bus is coming. That's an essential function, both for efficiency of the system, for customer satisfaction, as well as safety, because people know how long the wait is, and they're not left in the dark for 20 minutes wondering where the bus is. So I did a project on bus arrival time systems, and from there it kind of propelled into a job at the MTA, which still didn't have bus arrival time systems when I was there, but I tried to help it along. But I did work on the open data program when I was there, releasing GTFS data for the first time from the MTA, which allowed users to power apps and also have a greater sense of how the subway was running. So that's something I'm especially proud of.
So all of this connection to technology that we've had in the past kind of leads into the main part of our discussion, I feel like. You all released a report called AVs in New York City, a policy framework. What was the impetus for that report?
There's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement around autonomous vehicles, and it's clear that there's a market interest in these vehicles. And at the same time, they're being evaluated kind of in a vacuum in terms of the vehicle themselves, or the vehicle's safe. And that is 100% necessary. But we're not talking about them from an urbanism context and how would they fit into a city. And as people know, New York is a different city than much of America. And so if you're evaluating vehicle introductions to New York City, it should be a different approach than it would be in a different city. Most New Yorkers take transit. Most New Yorkers are pedestrians for a good part of their commute or their travel. And that is very different from the rest of the country.
That's an interesting point. I mean, New York has such a robust transit system. People walk everywhere. There's so many options to get around, especially now with City Bike and things like that. Why add another layer to that? Why add a layer of vehicles that are, basically the ancestors of cars?
Well, what's interesting is that assuming that autonomous vehicles won't be introduced into New York City or anywhere else until they're deemed safe enough to operate within a city, it is promising that they would provide a safer street environment. For example, an AV that is programmed or trained to stop for pedestrians is far more likely to actually do that than many New York City drivers who simply blow through a red light or disregard pedestrians who may be taking too long to cross the street. An AV could actually be much safer than a human driver in New York City. So there is potential there. I mean, it'll probably be a long time until the technology is there, but once it is there, we could have much safer streets, much more organized streets, and we could organize people into shared rides, ideally, because we do not need to introduce more cars to New York City. But we could potentially use these vehicles for microtransit or for deliveries in a more efficient format than we are using large buses with low ridership or large box trucks that need to be unloaded and are often double park. So the idea is to increase safety, efficiency, serve neighborhoods that are not well served through buses or rail at the moment, and also eliminate the erratic behavior of drivers that exists and pervades the city right now. Ideally, these vehicles would complement transit, either as a first mile, last mile solution or as a microtransit solution for things like job centers. New York, like most cities, has job centers like hospitals, airports, package sorting facilities, and stadiums, different places where people need to travel all hours of the day and night. And we can provide some really good transit solutions for these populations that would be perhaps faster and safer than the standard transit offerings right now.
You mentioned safety, and this is something that came up in your session yesterday as well. We're here at RailVolution in Miami. And you also had a questionnaire basically asking people like what the percentage of safe driving for an AV would be acceptable if it's 80% as safe as a human. As I think it was 90 and 98%, 100. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, my response was 100. I feel like politically, it would be hard to accept for people any death by a quote unquote unaccountable vehicle as opposed to a human driver. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, on the perception of safety versus actual safety versus the political pushback that, the safety discussion might get.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So I think it's difficult to narrow down how safe human drivers are, and especially human drivers in cities and human drivers in New York City, who I think are more aggressive than in several other places. So what percentage of the time do you think human drivers make the correct call or the safest call in a potential conflict?
Very low.
Very low. So somebody yesterday told me they think it's 99.5%, and I was leaning more towards about 70%.
Huh. Somebody said 99.5%? Oh, mm-hmm. No. I think You're probably right, more 70. I might even go 60%. 40,000 people die from collisions every year. I think that's a high number.
Exactly. People aren't making the safest decisions. They're making the most efficient decisions within the confines of traffic rules and regulations.
Right. And I feel like those collisions that I mentioned, the 40,000 plus, deaths, those are only the deaths. And there's a ton more injuries. There's a lot of more close calls. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I've been frustrated with as well, as those close calls not getting kind of the reaction that they should. Arterial street, somebody at a state DOT might say, oh, well, it's safe because only one person in the last 10 years passed away from the collision. But so many people aren't taking that street, whether they're cyclists or pedestrians, maybe because they're scared of it. And so that safety perception, I think, is an important aspect of this. And when we're talking about the potential future for AVs, everybody talks about the safety aspects. And I think that that's something that, the close calls and things like that, I think are important as well.
Yeah, I agree. So the question is, how safe do you think AVs should be? Assuming humans are, let's say 68% of the time making the safest decision, what percentage would you require from AVs to make the safest decision before allowing them on city streets?
I know that the numbers vary. I would say 100% still, because of the politics of if an AV hits somebody, the news of it. It's like when a plane crashes and it's news and craziness, but car crashes, there's maybe a police report or something like that, but for the most part, you never hear about it. But it's still somebody dying. And I think even, after the Elaine Herzberg death from Uber in Arizona, I think that really was a sea change time of discussing that, because unfortunately that happens a lot where people are walking in the middle of the street in the middle of the night and they get hit by a car. But thinking about the backlash politically and just from like a national perspective, that was kind of a window into, I feel like, that discussion in the future.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. I asked this question yesterday of you all on the panel too, and I think it's an interesting question. I'm wondering if AVs become a part of a city's fabric, should they be public or should they be private?
I'm going to say both. I do believe they should exist in a public-private partnership. And that is that there would be inclination by the private sector to serve the customers from which they would glean the most profit. However, in the public sector, there's a requirement, a mandate to serve everybody. And we need to be able to serve everybody. However, there is a lot of innovation and efficiency to be learned and tapped into in the private sector. And just like New York has about 6,000 buses that are mostly the same size, although there are a couple of different variations in there, but they follow the same route and schedules. That's not the dynamic thinking that we need going forward, especially if we're going to introduce a new fleet of vehicles. So I think that having a fleet of vehicles that can share data on things like road conditions and obstacles, having these vehicles serve everyone with a unified payment platform that would perhaps allow transfers to other modes of transit, or bike share, or taxis, other ways of getting around. They could be integrated into the transportation landscape. I think that this would allow for more of a public offering than simply another Uber or Lyft.
You mentioned data. From a data perspective, what are the types of data you expect would be collected from an AV scenario, and how do you think that would be managed?
So there are a lot of autonomous vehicle companies, both car manufacturers and car intelligence companies, working to manage 3D mapping or other data acquisition and sharing for these vehicles. The AVs can spot irregularities in the street environment, things like potholes, interruptions in lane markings, errors in signage, construction that's going beyond its permitted geography or time allotment. These are things that AVs can and do take in data on and can share both among their fleet and with cities. That's something that Nuro has done with their deployment in Houston, and the company Carmera, which is now part of Toyota Woven Planet, does a lot of 3D mapping where they can spot errors in signage or other issues with the roadway. And these help cities understand, what needs to be repaired and what needs to be changed based on data that they're getting that they may not otherwise receive.
We had Amanda Howell from Urbanism Next on recently, and she was talking about their pilot project with the Kiwi bots. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting parts of that study was that they were doing deliveries for food, and they thought that might be the best use case. But then one of the other use cases they found was that data collection use case. And I found that really interesting. And I think there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of terabytes of data that these cars are collecting, 3D or otherwise, that could be useful to cities, especially if they're thinking about, how they manage their public assets in the roadways.
Yeah, and it's especially true with sidewalk robots, which rely on curb cuts. They rely on consistent sidewalk offerings, which in many cities, sidewalks simply end or dump people out or not accessible to wheel-based mobility. And they may not be called in every time that happens, but a Kiwi bot or another sidewalk robot would detect that anomaly or detect that issue and share that data automatically. So I think that it takes some of the work out of knowing where the issues are, and it offers a new data point for cities to understand where they need to make changes.
What about equity? Thinking about like where these vehicles travel, if you were a public utility of some sort, you might be bound by, laws that require you to be equitable. However, if you're a private company, and they mentioned this yesterday in the panel, you don't have those restrictions. Not even restriction, but more like, requirements, I should say. What's the impact of these vehicles potentially on the equity of service in a city like New York?
There are a lot of different ways that AVs could and would likely affect equity in a place like New York City. For example, because the private sector would most likely pursue a density of customers, that would likely be in a place like Manhattan, where there would be a density of high-paying customers. And so, yet again, Manhattan would get the cool new thing first, which is an equity issue, whereas somewhere like the Bronx would come much later because there may not be a density of high-paying customers. So that issue is presented as an equity issue at the same time because AVs are not 100% safe yet, as we discussed. They may perpetuate this issue where lower income neighborhoods, and especially predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods in New York, and I think most cities in the United States, if not elsewhere too, have higher rates of pedestrian injury and fatality. And that's due to a number of factors, and Angie Schmidt in her book Right of Way outlines a lot of them. But basically, knowing that these neighborhoods have higher issues of pedestrian injury and fatality, what's the motivation for testing a new technology in these locations? If it's not 100% safe, are we really going to subject these neighborhoods to more technology that may or may not be safe? So that's another equity question. Furthermore, another aspect of equity is accessibility. And that's another vote in favor of the public sector hand in this deployment because you need these vehicles to be accessible. And that means wheelchair accessible, visual and auditory cues, a way to communicate with the vehicle and find out where you're going and how long it's going to take to get there. So you're not just traveling throughout a city, not knowing what's going on. And things like language translation, allowance for service animals. There are a lot of aspects to accessibility that are often reduced simply to wheelchair accessibility, and that's just not the only one. How can a person who's visually impaired know where their ride is if there's no human providing the interaction between the person and the vehicle and saying your vehicle has arrived? How can a person who is hearing impaired know what announcements are happening? So these are all questions that the public sector and public transit systems already grapple with and also will need to happen in AVs serving the public sector.
Taxis are a big part of New York City. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what happens to taxis if AVs become a reality.
That's a good question. In New York City, we have tens of thousands of taxis and professional drivers. And it is reasonable to think that taxi drivers will be shifted from the physical driving of the vehicle to actually operating the vehicle and helping a person in and out with bags and making sure they're avoiding traffic or otherwise keeping an eye on the road as backup for the automated driving, but not doing the actual pressing of the pedal and turning the wheel.
That's an interesting point. I feel like there's a lot of concern among the transit industry as well. Even though there's a bus driver shortage at the moment around the country, there's also a fear that good jobs would be taken away from drivers. And so there's a tension there between the ability to create jobs and have work and also the ability to have a vehicle that doesn't necessarily need a physical driver to move around.
Yeah, and when we talk about equity, that is an equity issue. Driving taxis or driving professionally is one of the top entry-level immigrant jobs, especially in New York City. We have I believe it's about 75% new immigrants who are driving taxis or for the rideshare companies. So how can we help these new immigrants get new jobs that they're qualified for and can hold down while their jobs are automated?
Recently, there was a company, Argo AI, that went under or was discontinued. I guess they were part of Ford. I've had Peter Norton on the show and Paris Marx talking about how, kind of the snake oil salesman factor of autonomous vehicles. I'm curious if we're looking at them in the wrong way in some aspects and, thinking about them, as I mentioned before, as kind of the ancestors of cars rather than a whole new mobility paradigm it could be autonomous buses. It could be larger scale vehicles. I think we have a tendency to think of them as 4-door vehicles that carry maybe 1 or 2 passengers. I'm curious your thoughts on kind of that shift in thinking or that skepticism as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We shouldn't think of them the same way we've been thinking about the sedan or the SUV that's sitting in someone's driveway. We should be thinking about perhaps a technology that can be extracted from the vehicle and used in a public bus or a train that could help with safety and efficiency in that vehicle. We could be thinking about these vehicles as moving living rooms or offices, places where people are kind of on the move and being productive, and as they are on public transit already. So we do need to rethink this mobility framing. There was one other point that
Just the skepticism, I think. Like a lot of these companies, it feels like there's a lot of frustration with the discussion about AVs and also the sensationalism to get funding for a lot of these companies to try to become unicorns in one way or another, and being a money play rather than a mobility play or an access play, like something that's better for overall, humanity, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we're thinking about AVs on the federal level, which we certainly need to, but there's a lot to be said for local kind of home rule of these technologies. For example, AVs may function really well on a highway where people aren't crossing the street, where you're most likely not going to encounter a cyclist when you're going 65 miles an hour. That could be a really good use case for autonomous vehicles, which a lot of companies like Aurora or Embark are working on the truck side of things. And I think that that's a great development and another area where we're facing a labor shortage. If we can make trucks safer and more efficient and easier on the drivers, I think that that would be a fantastic development. But we're not going to apply the same regulations for trucking as we do for urban travel because it's just a completely different animal. And so I think every city needs to consider what are the impacts to their urban life on these vehicles. What are the impacts from these vehicles on their urban life and well-being? So we talked about safety, of course, and equity. There's also the question of sustainability. There's safety within the vehicle if it's a shared ride. There's interaction with first responders. There's rethinking of the curb, which is already happening, and the introduction of AVs would probably accelerate that discussion. And overall, there is a conversation about the experience of mobility. And I think that that's on the forefront of a lot of conversations right now, not just getting people from point A to point B as quickly as possible, but also making sure that the experience is safe and perhaps even enjoyable.
We're having an interesting time in cities right now, in part because of the pandemic. There was a lot of, especially in New York City, there's a lot of streeteries and sheds, I guess, as they're called there. Yeah. And I think it's changed the way that some people look at the streets. And, it's interesting to think about what people's mindset might be now if AVs are introduced, what might happen to some of those places that people have taken back for pedestrianism or cycling.
It's a good question. And one thing that I love about it is that AVs could potentially park elsewhere and not on streets. So there wouldn't be this battle for curb space. If there's no need for parking, we could line the curb with more dining, with more parklets, with other purposes other than personally owned vehicles. I think that's really exciting. I agree that COVID has brought about this rethinking of our public space, rethinking of our streets. And I think it's fantastic to see. I mean, it overall has brought out this existential crisis in cities where people say, oh, cities are dying. But in actuality, it's only dying if you think of cities as the only reason you would go to a city is to go to your office, when in fact cities are places of culture and dining and diversity and music and arts and all sorts of ways to enjoy being around other people and being around things that people create, and not just an office where you go to sit in a conference room and talk with people.
That commercial monoculture is such an interesting discussion, especially about cities, mostly cities that are smaller in size and stature than, say, Chicago, New York City, maybe Philadelphia, San Francisco. Obviously, San Francisco has a huge downtown monoculture of commercial, buildings, but I found that in my neighborhood, specifically in San Francisco, there wasn't much change in the pedestrian activity and life, commercial activity. I don't think that there were any, maybe one or two, but I don't think that there were any stores that even went out of business because people were, they feel locally connected to the place. So that's interesting to think about from an overall perspective. I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about climate change and transportation systems. We're 10 years out from Hurricane Sandy. I'm curious if there are any policy lessons that we can learn a decade later, or that have been learned over the last decade, I should say.
Yeah, there are a few. As I think you know, we at the NYU Rudin Center wrote a report right after Hurricane Sandy about the impacts of the storm on New York's transportation, all modes. And what we saw, especially from Sandy, I think obviously the greatest impact was the flooding, which caused several deaths, things like falling tree limbs, real tragedies. The infrastructure impact was especially from the combination of storm and rising sea levels coming into the city at once, which brought salt water into the subway tunnels, where the salt was extraordinarily corrosive to the equipment and damaging to the subway tunnels. So that was a huge impact and really brought into question, what is our long-term plan for flooding and for the subways? And the city has done a lot of work with rain gardens and porous pavement and other surface level measures, which really helps the flow of water stay on the surface rather than flowing down into the subway. And the subway system has done a lot of work on floodgates and other measures to keep water out of the tunnels. I'd say that there are two primary things that we should take from it. And the first is that even though Hurricane Sandy was 10 years ago and we learned so much from it, Hurricane Ida was 1 year ago, and it was also terrible. People were killed in their basements with the flooding, and that was not even related to water coming in from the rising seas. It was a flash storm. It was New York City's first ever citywide flash flood warning in history. And as we saw with Ida and other storm events, we're seeing more fast, angry storms than we ever have before. So the lesson is that we are fighting this battle on two fronts. One, rising sea levels, and secondly, a totally new storm system that is unexpected. These storms are causing flooding where climate experts did not predict in terms of which subway stations would be affected. And so we have to kind of rethink the whole scenario. The second lesson that I think continues to be a lesson, which we learned during COVID as well, was that we need very nimble transportation systems. Because we don't know what the impacts of a storm or any other natural disaster might be. If the subway is out, if the power is out, we need to substitute right away with buses. After Sandy, we had buses subbing in for subways that weren't running. But the second that we know that a subway isn't running, we need to be able to kind of summon a number of bus shuttles as well as shared taxis, bike share, other modes that people can hop onto if they need to and make it financially transferable so that they can have a transfer rate onto these other modes, and basically so that the city can continue getting people where they need to go. During an emergency event, people may need to run to the school to pick up their kids. They may need to rush over to take care of an elderly relative. They may need to simply get home or away from a low-lying building that they're in at the moment. There are a lot of reasons people need to get around immediately before a storm event. And so we need to be able to be nimble and know what's happening where and build in substitutes or alternate modes right away.
You mentioned rain gardens and other solutions. When there's so much water from these climate change-induced rain events, do those move the needle? Can you deal with 10, 15 inches of rain in a day with, the small solutions? And I'm not saying small in a negative way. I'm just saying, there's a certain amount of water that it just has to go somewhere.
Right. The water does have to go somewhere. The rain gardens and porous pavement certainly help. They make a dent. I think the city has built about 11,000 rain gardens, and we need more. And I do think it makes a dent, but it's correct. I mean, Tokyo, which deals with a lot of storms as well as rising sea levels, has built massive cisterns underground. I believe one of them is the size of the Empire State Building laid sideways. And that's the kind of infrastructure that you need if you're really going to deal with that amount of water coming in.
It's crazy. It's like, I think I was looking at something that you wrote or something the Rudin Center put out where there was a picture of the cistern in, I think it was Tokyo. And it looks like it could be part of some sci-fi movie, is like Cavern or something like that, or like the Emperor's Lair in Star Wars or something. It's like creepy and post-apocalyptic, but also useful.
Yes.
Very interesting infrastructure. We talk about rain events and climate change and the impacts, but we're also creating a lot of emissions with our transportation system. And I think a lot of people are pinning their hopes on electric vehicles for the solution, but I'm not really sure if that's good enough. What do you think needs to be done to reduce emissions overall from the transportation system that basically provides such a huge percentage of emissions globally?
Yeah, so obviously transportation emissions are massive, but when people use transit, their personal emissions are far lower. We need to be able to get people out of their cars, and we can't just ask someone in Kansas to stop using their car because they live in a car-dependent place, and there's no way for them to get around otherwise in many scenarios. But what we do need to do is build in alternative modes that are actually viable. So not a bus that comes twice a day, but a bus that comes every 15 minutes or so. And I realize that America is so sprawling in most places that that is not feasible. But what we can do now with the advent of data analytics and a better understanding of how people move around is develop microtransit or shared rides that people can rely on, that people can summon as they need to in places like suburbs or smaller cities where there is some density, but not quite the rural sprawling areas where you really are reliant on a vehicle. The more that we can get people to find modes other than a personally owned vehicle, the better off we'll be in terms of emissions. Of course, we have other issues, not just gas emissions, that contribute to climate change. We have suburban sprawl, where people are living farther apart, which requires more paving over of natural lands. Obviously, that leads to less natural absorption of rainwater and less ability to fight wildfires. There are all these challenges presented by just simply having a reliance on vehicles, whether or not that vehicle is electric or gas. I also wonder if America's power grids are up to the task of serving electric vehicles. I imagine a future where all these vehicles that are now electric are plugged in every evening at 6 p.m. and then the grid goes down. I do like the new model that we saw, especially in Texas last winter, where people were powering their homes off of their electric vehicles when the power went out, which I thought is a really interesting new way of transferring power between a home and a vehicle. And I think that, that may be more of a future in terms of electric vehicles.
The whole battery situation is interesting from the resource needs for lithium and the extraction process and all that stuff. And I almost get a little frustrated sometimes at the discussion about trying to make like every bus battery electric. And I'm not against it. I'm just wondering, like, we have this wonderful, and I'm biased obviously because I am the overhead wire. That's my handle. But we have centuries old technology that allows us to give power to transit vehicles in San Francisco and Seattle and previously Boston and Dayton, Ohio. There were overhead electric wires for vehicles, and they could take as much as they needed or not as much. And I wonder if we're trying too hard to avoid overhead electrification and, put a big battery in every single vehicle we possibly can.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I also am concerned because so many power outages are caused by branches falling on power lines, and it would take a lot of maintenance of trees and of these power lines, especially for storms, that I'm not sure how the balance would weigh out, when you consider the maintenance level.
Yeah. What are you most optimistic about?
I'm optimistic that the younger generation, I guess Gen Z or Generation Alpha.
We have a new one now?
Yeah. I guess if we got to Z, we have to restart. These generations are really focused on, having a planet to live on in the future. So they're really focused on improving the climate change trajectory that we're on right now. And I do think they understand that there are a lot of components to that, like avoiding meat and obviously avoiding personally owned vehicles. Obviously, car culture is very much part of America and the American dream, but I don't necessarily think that's true for the younger generations when they start learning a lot, when they get on urbanist TikTok, and when they start talking to each other about how their lifestyles fit into the climate goals.
It's funny, I've heard that from I asked the question a few times of folks, and that's a frequent answer, that the youth are moving and they have different ideals and ideas.
Great.
And I'm very excited about that. Well, we're here at RailVolution, and this is my first conference since TRB in January 2020. How are you doing in the real world?
So one thing about the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation is that we've always been a hub of conversation. We've always gathered people together from the public and private sector, nonprofit, advocacy. We always provide this safe space for people to talk about their issues and their solutions and what's going on in the industry, and to have these down-to-earth conversations. And we haven't been able to have those gatherings for a long time. And I'm glad to say that starting in the spring, we will have events much more consistently, and we will be able to bring people together. And so hopefully we can start working on a lot more solutions to the problems we've been talking about.
Awesome. Where can folks find your work if they want to get copies of the report or find you and ask questions or anything along those lines?
Well, they can find our work at nyurudincenter.com, RUDIN. And I'm on LinkedIn, Sarah Kaufman. I am not the MMA fighter. I am not the Pulitzer Prize winning dance reviewer or the cheese sculptor. But you should be able to find me pretty easily on LinkedIn.
I know where you're coming from. There's a country singer, a NASCAR driver, Jeff Wood. There's a guy on death row in Texas.
Wow.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. Well, Sarah, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at USA.org/podcasts. nyc.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.